Now, to dive into spies and mocks, I will actually start with spies. And for this, I'll not focus on this code right now, here in io.js or io.test.js. We'll get back to it later instead, but I want to focus on data.js. Here we have another scenario where we care about whether some function is called, or where we might care about this at least. In generate report data, we are, generating some data, and we might want to test whether that works correctly, but we also might want to test whether the log function gets called if a log function is provided. If someone would accidentally remove this code, then we want a test that finds out that the argument is ignored. And therefore here I'll add a data.test.js file. And in this file, we can now create a new testing suite, because in data.js I actually have two functions, and I want to create a suite for the first function, generate report data. So that's my identifier here. And then in this suite, we can add our tests. Again, I'll do it with it here. We also can already import expect. And here I want to make sure that generate report data should execute log fn if provided, so that it's not ignored. That's what I want to test here. Now, to achieve this, we of course need to call generate report data. And now we will not import the log function, but instead I just want to find out whether the log function gets called. So we can create such a spy replacement object. And this also is important. The log function also has a side effect. Logging to the console interacts with the system console, which is an external system, if you want to call it like that, and therefore this technically also is a side effect. Not a bad one, not like writing to a file or writing to a database. It doesn't change anything on the system, but it still technically is a side effect, and you might want to get rid of it. Also, since you're probably not going to write some code that checks what was written to the console anyways, because you don't want to check whether console log works technically. It's not your code, you don't want to check it. You might want to check whether your message is used, but not whether it works. So therefore, we don't want to use the original log function here in data.test.js, but instead such a spy replacement. For this, I'll add a logger constant, and now we can import a special object from vtest, and that's the v object. And you also have a similar object if you would be using jest. There it's the jest object, which is imported from jest globals. So we import this v object, and for jest on the jest object, you can call a fn method. Again, this exists for both vtest and jest. And what fn does is it creates an empty function which, and that's important, keeps track of any function executions of that function. So of any calls to that function. It also keeps track of the arguments that were provided with those calls. So now we got this empty replacement object with this spy functionality, and it's this function, this logger function, which I now pass to generate report data. This function doesn't actually do anything, but it allows us to find out whether it was executed because it's a spy. So therefore, thereafter, we can write our assertion and expect that logger was executed. And this is done by expecting logger. Here we're not executing it. We don't have parentheses. We just pointed it. So we expect that logger was called. And for this, we have the to be called or to have been called methods. And you can use either of the two. So whatever you prefer. Here I'll use to be called. And this will now only make the test pass if logger was called. So if I save this and I run npm test, I got a passing test here. So my data test.js file passes. And if we now would change the code in data.js and some colleague or maybe we ourselves would remove that code and we would therefore ignore the log function, we could easily find this problem by running our tests again, and now we would have a failing test because we expected our spy to be called at least once, which clearly wasn't the case here. So of course I'm going to bring back that code, but that is how we can create such a spy function and how we can use it. And that can often be very useful because it turns out that In quite a lot of scenarios, you're only interested in finding out whether something was called, and you don't need any other check or functionality. And spy objects, spy functions are perfect in such scenarios.